Hadley, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. It's a pleasure to talk to you, as always.
Thanks for inviting me in, Ben.
So I wanted to run through a number of different things with you about the Dobbs v. Jackson decision. But first off, I wanted to just ask you, in terms of your initial reaction, we've never had the chance to talk about the bizarre occurrence, the horrible occurrence, I feel, of the leak of this well ahead of time in a way that, I certainly in my lifetime have never seen happen before. What was your reaction to that leak when it happened?
Oh, it was devastating. It was just despicable, because what you're inviting the justices now to be political players. That when something comes out, we leak it, say we're making clear where we're going to be standing, and it's all open out to the pressure generated from the outside. It alters the vocation of judging. So it's, I don't know if they'll be able to, I suppose that if they find the person who did it, he will probably be lionized and celebrated in the corners of the people who find this as the most important anchoring right of their personal freedom.
I hope that they do find that person, and I hope that once we get through the next, the release of several decisions that are still upcoming, that we do find out, what ended up happening there and who was the real cause. When you read the leaked decision, what was your initial reaction to it? And did you feel that it was something that basically was fully formed as an argument?
It was fully formed according to the doctrines that have been developed in the circles of most people doing conservative jurisprudence. And it was that the other side talks about the rights, depriving people of reproductive rights. And a woman's right to control her own body. But on the talk shows, I don't hear the clerks for Thomas and Alito saying, the right to control your own body has never provided a warrant for dismembering or poisoning another body. Mm-hmm. The conservative approach has been the same. Not to meet that moral argument. I mean, to look at the dissent. The dissent is filled with moral passion. The conservative argument is that the right to abortion is nowhere contained in the Constitution. Also, the right to marriage was nowhere contained in the Constitution. When the court struck down the laws that barred marriage across racial lines in 1967, and as Jerry Bradley pointed out a while back, the federal government had many reasons to be dealing with abortion in the military outpost, diplomatic outpost, abortion in the District of Columbia. That's not that there's something about abortion that puts it outside the reach of the national government. The question, years ago in Roe, the lawyers for Texas offered a remarkable brief, which they drew upon the latest findings of embryology, the development of the child, woven with principle reasoning. And they were able to extract this critical point, that child in the womb has never been anything but human from its very first moments. It receives its nourishment from the mother, but has never been merely a part of the mother. Now, the critical sign is that in the course of the opinion, I saw this in the draft opinion, and you see it now, the conservative side goes out of its way not to speak those magic words, not to put that predicate in place. Because they put that predicate in place, then you lay the ground for the Congress coming in later under the 14th Amendment, and the federal court saying, what we see now in the separate states, blue states, is the withdrawal of the protections of law from a whole class of human beings. I mean, we saw this in the South, mm-hmm. when the federal courts talked themselves into the understanding that even under the principles of federalism, the federal government could act, and the federal courts could act, when the protections of the law were withdrawn from black people in the South. So in other words, our people have not put that thing in place. One of the strangest comments here, coming from Justice Breyer, was like it sounded like a messenger coming in from a galaxy far away. He said, well, this case is the woman has no rights even in the first trimester of the first days of the pregnancy. No, that's not at all true, because the court deliberately foreclosed making that kind of argument. You may indeed have those rights. Those rights will be available to her in New York, California, Oregon, Minnesota. So the conservative line, this has been my point of disappointment, that it doesn't put the actual moral ground. See, what the lawyers for Texas were doing years ago, they're simply trying to show that child has been human from its first moment. If we're dealing with a human being, then there's those laws in Texas that cast the protection of the law on these human beings were justified. So it all had to be said. But instead of doing that, the court would have said, well, it's not in the Constitution. And we have no. In fact, we used the point of Brett Kavanaugh in this case. The court, because there's no moral judgment. The Constitution may be utterly indifferent to the question of killing. No, you studied Lincoln and Douglas on this point, where Douglas says, God made good and evil and bade us choose. And Lincoln said, the first time you did that, I thought you were making a joke, but no. God said there was one tree, the fruit of which you may not eat. But as Harry Jaffa pointed out, this was kind of the degradation of the democratic dogma that is the system is all process and no substance. You're free to choose anything you want. Slavery, genocide, through this system. As long as you do it in a formally democratic way with the vote of the majority. And what you seem to pass over is, are you sure that the system itself, the underlying principles on which this regime of consent was based, which we understood, we knew what was a human person who deserved to be ruled with his own consent. Are you sure that the underlying principles of this regime do not contain the principles that would reject slavery and genocide and the killing of the innocent? That's been nice, but I've seen this bend, though. It's, the connection I've made has been to the Emancipation Proclamation. Because, when Lincoln came out with that, some people said it had all the moral force of a bill of lading, because all you've told us is that we may remove slavery in the states that are still at war with the government. But we don't touch slavery in the border states, like Delaware, that is still loyal to the Union. And yet, even though it was as a war measure, Lincoln understood he had no power to remove that vast body of property, of property of slaves. Even how limited it was, it was clearly understood to have an anti-slavery animating force. And so my sense been, say 2 cheers for this. It's not exactly what I've wanted, but it is a move to be celebrated. And I think it puts in place, I think it may, people understand that it's really as a pro-life animating force.
Much of the tug of war that has occurred within the last almost half century within the pro-life movement has been a tug of war between incrementalists and abolitionists. Is this essentially a vindication, or can be read as at least a partial vindication of the incrementalist approach to dealing with abortion? Or is it an indictment that it took this long to get to this point and it's still just 2 cheers?
Well, it's a incrementalism are us, as you know. I was the one who took the line that we begin with the most modest first step of all. Can we simply protect the child who survives the abortion? Because we have one federal judge telling us we can't do that. That's not a child protected by the law. It's a fetus marked for termination. So we came forth with this bill to protect the child born alive. The Democrats went along with it 20 years ago. Now we've tried recently, as you know, to restore the penalties that originally stripped for that bill, to make it enforceable. Virtually every Democrat in the House voted against. In other words, the Democrats have now aligned with the position that their right to abortion does not end even at the point of pregnancy. The right to abortion is the right to end effective abortion or a dead child. What's remarkable is how many take it out of that line. What's disappointing for me is I don't think the incremental strategy has held. If it had held, we wouldn't see people like my friends at the Wall Street Journal saying, well, don't have to compromise on this. It'll be 12 weeks. It could be 13 weeks. Well, as Samuel Alito pointed out, on this question of viability, if human life could be protected after viability, why can't it be protected before viability? There's been no change in the nature of that being who's being killed.
Mm-hmm.
It's not altered as human standing, shifting before viability to after viability. If you understand that, then you understand, no, it makes no difference if you take it down to 15 weeks or 10 weeks. So when our friends at the Wall Street Journal say, let's do this. It's like Nelson Rockefeller goes, you don't like 24 weeks. It was kind of vulgarity. Now our people talk about it plausibly, but the point is that should be, if incremental strategy would have worked, that should be the point that would be dubious right now and deserve to be challenged. They start with that position that, of course, even Brett Kavanaugh said, well, people may make this early on, people make this, they make a decision to protect it, they may not make a decision, they may not make more difference. But they're losing hold of why are you protecting that being? Mm-hmm. Why are you protecting that entity? If it's a human being, the laws of homicide have always been indifferent to the size and weight and the development of that human entity. Mm-hmm. The fact that so many of our people are confused, even at the highest levels of writers of the conservative movement, indicates something has not quite taken hold. Because part of that incremental movement say, look, you understand the child, you're not quibbling about the child at the point of birth. It's detached from the mother. You're not doubting its human standing. Of course, what we said then is, look, we're going to ask you what was different about that same being 5 minutes before, 5 days before, 5 months before. And that's where we're going. We didn't hide that. So if we understood the incremental strategy, the point was to plant the notion that of course you're dealing with the human being from its first moments. And yet, clearly, in some of the most critical places of conservative commentary, that's not taken hold.
I have read numerous reactions to this in the media, and one aspect in particular that seems to be cropping up a lot is members of the media, including those who have expressed loudly their opinions on this issue, discovering to their horror that much of the Western world, particularly the vast majority of Europe, has laws that are, even restrictive even earlier than Mississippi. And we're talking about journalists at the New York Times and people who purport to be experts on these subjects who are running into this. I think it's interesting, their ignorance, but it seems to me just of a piece of how ignorant the media coverage of this story has been, even to the point that many Americans believed that if Roe versus Wade went away, it meant abortions across the country were banned. To what degree, as you've paid attention to the media coverage of this issue for so long,
yes,
to what degree is that ignorance or the advancement of that ignorance intentional on the part of the media in order to create a cloud around Roe that effectively functioned as a protective sort of encircling, something that pretended that its absence would mean something that it did not?
Ben, I wish it could be imputed to ignorance. It can't be.
Yeah.
It can't be. Look, 30 years ago, at my dinner table, you remember the Eugene Rostow, this good friend, he was shocked when I explained to him that under Roe versus Wade and the companion case, you can have abortion throughout the entire length of the pregnancy. He was shocked. He thought it was confined only to the first 3 months. A dear friend of mine, at one of the most prestigious law schools in the country, took a survey of 25 of her colleagues about 20 years ago to ask about Roe versus Wade, and only 5 of them could give a faintly accurate account of what is in it. Which is why some of us have urged that we have candidates for the court. We ask them, would you give us an account of what is in Roe versus Wade? Would you explain what it is? Their lawyers don't understand it. Look, we found, remember, Rich Derfinger of the Catholic Bishops' Conference, studying the data, pointed out years ago that about 60% of the country would be opposed to 90% of the abortions under Roe. But yet most of these people are against overturning Roe. Well, how do you explain that? The answer was, most people don't know what's in it, which is why I take a look at these surveys. The search, even people call themselves pro-choice. have declared their resistance to accept abortion for the sake of allowing women to finish school. Or when a child is deaf. No. We don't know what this covers. What we know is that, look, even now, like the Born Alive Act, they take the life of the child. Why does that still shock people? It's not an accident. When we brought that forth, Ben, we thought we would break through. By putting it at this level, we would break out to the public, news that the public would find joke. Like how you can have an abortion even when the child comes out. But that bill, and the story of that bill, has been, to this day, blacked out. Mm-hmm. It's not covered. It's not covered in the media. Even if Fox News has not picked it up, which really surprised me. People don't want to talk about this. So this ignorance of the public, you're right. For years, the notion has been sustained that if abortion is overly struck down, people would be overnight dispossessed of this anchoring right of their personal freedom. Mm-hmm. It hasn't been dislodged because the media have just not been interested.
I mean, honestly, other than the incident regarding Governor Ralph Northam, I felt like this was an issue where there's been virtually no conversation at all.
That's right.
And that was the one point where people were they reacted with such horror because of what he said. But from my perspective, he was actually just describing something that we all know happens. All of us who actually pay attention to the way that these things proceed.
When we came forth with that bill 20 years ago to protect the child born alive, we had with us Jill Stanek, who was a wonderful nurse at the Christ Hospital in Oak Lawn, Illinois. She blew the whistle on the so-called live birth abortion. You deliver the child alive, and you put her in the refuse room to die. The same with abortion law, right? No instruments into the body. Jill got on the air, and nurses were calling in from other parts of the country saying, "Are you kidding? We've been doing that for years." Mm-hmm. We had no idea even then of how often this was done, what numbers it was done. And then, of course, we had the revelations several years ago of Kermit Gosnell in Philadelphia with that abattoir he was running. Later abortions, the next a baby was snipped. And it confirmed the case for our point. People said, look, why do you need this? If it's a homicide, it can be treated under the laws of homicide. But the police in Philadelphia had the sense that they had to steer around those clinics because they had the sense that something going on there was somehow bound with a constitutional right that's out there. Mm-hmm. Now, my friends at the Wall Street Journal say, no, they're right to kill the baby, part of it. The court rejected that years ago. But if so, the court never explained it was rejecting it. And if it explained it, why do we still find so much evidence of this practice among us? But anyway, going back to your main point, Ben, the whole point of it was to break out to the public information that the public, we thought, would find jolting. And the curious part is that how much that news has been blacked out, obscured over the years.
So one of the things that is really interesting and I think challenging in the wake of this decision is the level to which people are very unsure of what's going to come next. Right. I would like to have you kind of chart out the path on that in terms of the battles that you expect to play out and what some of the key flashpoint issues are going to become, since everything has been so focused on Roe in terms of the conversation to the degree that it's existed. What is the next conversation in terms of what you expect?
It's an interesting question. All the momentum now seems to be on the side of people who are furious about the decision. But it could be that the real energy will come to the pro-life side. We've been gearing for this for a long time. We've been active in the States. But my own sense, and that old Born Alive Infant Protection Act, that could be the thing to introduce into the blue states. Assure yourself emphatically pro-abortion that you will not be able to accept the child, that protects the child at the point of birth. That could be the thing that could perhaps crack open some of the monolith of opinion in the blue states. It would also help for the Congress, because if you look at what Jack Kavanaugh and the opinion is saying is that there's no ground for national legislation on this matter. Kavanaugh, we can't have a nationwide policy. We even have to protecting the child born alive. So to put in that deal right now would be to establish against the toehold in the national legislation. Of course, you'll have it anyway with the matter of abortion in the military service and everything. But on the other side, I do expect that the defenders of abortion be quite active in testing those laws passed in the states behind abortion from the very point of conception. But the curious thing, though, Ben, is that I find there's something consoling in that because it would force the conservative judges to do what I was complaining years ago that the dissenters in Roe never did not do. That is, the argument would be made that, my goodness, this thing bill protects this thing in the womb before the test of liability. How could it be justified? And the federal judge to sustain those laws would have to say, well, of course, as Alito says, it is not less of a human being before the point of viability. It is not less of a human being anywhere. Well, we don't see what the marker is, which is another way of getting back to the judges actually getting explicit on the point. But we are dealing with small human beings. Because the stage of the pregnancy has no relation to their standing as human beings. It's going to heat up that way too.
I want to give you an example of something that I think goes to your point. This morning, Freddie Deboer, who is a leftist writer with sort of contrarian, sometimes interesting views, but someone who I pay attention to because he's rather influential within his circles, is out with a statement. And he's, of course, not just an ultra pro-abortion guy, but someone who's quite vocal about it. And he's basically out with it's more than a rant. It's basically a call to arms for the pro-abortion movement to engage in purposeful acts of criminal disobedience on the subject in red states, and to essentially create what he describes, without any sense of irony, I think, or what he's actually saying, as an underground railroad for abortions. And he calls on the left to basically do so in an organized fashion across the country, but particularly targeting red state policies and the like. Should something like that occur, what do you think the natural reaction to that is going to be? And do you think that there is going to be a kind of an attempt on the part of Republicans who, want to push a generally pro-life agenda, but have been uncomfortable making or dealing with any of these harder cases? Do you think that they're basically going to cave on this subject if confronted by such an opposition?
I worry more about caving in response to the woke corporations. Saying if you're willing to leave over the question of transgenderism and putting up barring material to children in third grade, how many of them will be willing to sort of threaten to leave if these kinds of laws are put in place? We've already had examples of district attorneys claiming they will not enforce these new statutes, which bring things to another level within the states. I don't know. I would have thought that the reactions to the violence in the streets since 2020 over George Floyd would have generated even more powerful reaction than it has. It's starting to generate that reaction.
No.
You think that Black Lives Matter would be a little embarrassed over this kind of what's been generated. I'm sure that the country would recoil from this kind of violence. What I see in it, though, the old phrase, those people, that class that see things, it forms the machine. We got this from the class that the deep government, when Trump came in, people who really control the government say, this, we will not have this. We'll use whatever method we have to undo this. Mm-hmm. And that's what I see at work here. People could not persuaded that their side, they are the ones who they are the ones who give the moral doctrines to the rest of the country. And they will just not put up with this.
Yeah. That statement, just to your point, can you address that statement that was released from Merrick Garland in the Department of Justice?
What was that?
Basically the statement, this lengthy statement that they released saying that they would do basically everything they could to protect reproductive freedom, and it was basically a shot across the bow of the court.
Yes, I think they're probably going to use every executive order they can to promote abortion in the military service and international fora, and I'd expect to see a little bit more activity in protecting the judges whose families are really in danger right now. I would expect a real show of force there, an expression of concern from the highest level. So I'm a little disappointed that Merrick Garland hasn't been stronger in his
disappointment is a mild word for the way that I feel about Merrick Garland. The attitude of governors like Ron DeSantis, governors like Glenn Youngkin, has been pretty immediately to say, basically, we're going to go where the Mississippi law is currently. There are, however, many other states that have gone further than that in terms of either earlier limits or approaches to banning that are more that are wider. In terms of the long-term dynamic going on there, do you believe that within, say, a decade, the default position of a conservative pro-life Republican governor will be to make whatever policies that are adopted within the next 6 months, say that it's 12 to 15 week bans, will they have a defensive posture about maintaining those? Or do you think that there will come to be an appetite to push that line earlier and earlier, and that will become a new sort of pro-life aim within the states when people are running for governor and the like?
It's going to be divided. As you know, they're members of this political class who would see this move to bring it back to the states and say, good, we don't have to talk about this anymore. And many Republicans in Congress say, just get that off the plate. We're tired of talking about this. This is same-sex marriage or gay rights. We're not comfortable talking about it. So some of them would be comfortable just, we don't have to vote on it, just put it in the state. And of course there'll be governors subject to those pressures from the corporations also. My hunch, though, is that certainly the pro-life movement in places like Texas, Tennessee, Mississippi, we're going to just take this as the moment to really step up and get that. To deal with that fallacy that seems to be gripping even our friends at the Wall Street. You talk about stages of this. They don't think is irrelevant and morally irrelevant, and really now finally make the moral case that it's not a matter of whether it was in the Constitution. It's just that these laws are eminently justified against those protections. So I think that will be a real force. And my hunch is that I hope that the energy really will shift to the pro-life side now. But again, I don't discount that. I'm a conservative in this respect. I don't discount the possibilities. There are a number of Republicans who are the whole thing. I think there are friends at Fox. I think they have the sense that then viewers find the whole conference the topic uncomfortable. They don't want to talk about it. Okay.
Well, I just have to interject. That obviously, not only do have I done entire hours in prime time on the abortion issue, but right now, Fox Nation has my documentary "Overturning Roe," which was released over the weekend and on Friday, and immediately in response to the decision. But what I will say to you, in just in response to this, is that generally, what you will hear from the media that is conservative, not just Fox, but many other networks. And obviously, I'm at Fox, and I understand this, is that this is an issue that people recoil from, meaning that as viewers, they do not like to see it because it makes them uncomfortable. And what I would suggest to you is that has unfortunately been part of the reason why we've had such a terrible quality of conversation about this, and why so much lack of awareness persists even on the side of those who tend toward the pro-life side. Meaning your average Christian Republican voter who tends to be pro-life often doesn't know, lacks the same level of knowledge too about a lot of the legal ramifications of this. But I do actually want to get back with the time that we have left to questions of law. The thing that I find to be I share your frustration in general about the way that this kind of came to pass and not being ideal. But it does seem to me that there is an element of this that I think could be built on in different directions. The left currently is making the argument, in part, I think, revealing how unpopular something like Roe actually is, that the approach used by Clarence Thomas indicates a massive increase in the number of people who are going to be at risk in other areas, namely that it's going to be the end of contraception, it's going to be the end of gay marriage. Rachel Maddow is out there on MSNBC saying, gay people need to prepare to have their families broken up by the government and the like. I don't view this as a shift in any way in Thomas's opinion. Obviously, these were things that he's simply expressing the same belief that he's always had. To what degree do you believe that to be feasible, or just another example of Thomas's opinion?
I don't think he has any votes for that among his colleagues.
Yeah.
And I was a little surprised by that, because he is, these people on the court have had to go through some political barriers and tests to get things. I'm usually they're politically savvy as well. And I just was surprised that he would raise that kind of issue now. And he'd simply stir anxiety, and especially when he doesn't have the votes for it. On the other hand, you raise issue of law here. The dissent makes this telling point. So let's just take the grounds in which the conservatives make the argument here. They don't want to talk about whether those earlier decisions were justified or unjustified. They simply want to say those rights were not. They could talk about tradition. So, well, the right to contraception was not. So does that would point out? Look, contraception was widely banned. Interracial marriage. When Loving versus Virginia came out, about half the states still banned interracial marriage. So if the test is, if simply we're trading, as the conservatives do, for making any moral judgments on the rightness or wrongness of decisions, then the other side has a critical point. So what it points out is that the conservatives need to say that that decision on contraception was a justified decision. The decision on marriage was a justified decision. They're, as several leaders say, we need to know the taking of the human life. It's something in an entirely different register.
Do you think that they're prepared to make that argument?
No, but I think they've laid the groundwork for it. In all fairness. I mean, what Sam Alito says, it doesn't, viability does not make a difference as to whether we're dealing with a human entity. He's laid the groundwork for those judges later on saying, well, no, it's without making the move to make the points explicit, working with the constraints of that legal doctrine he's working on. We that old line of Justice Holmes, that the aspiration of the modern project was to remove all moral words from the law altogether. And sometimes our people sound like that. They're kind of say, oh, morality has nothing to do with the Constitution. Well, working within those constraints You say, well, they've still put in place the key points upon which the judges can reason in making that fuller argument. You could say this. Oh, by the way, Ben, may I say, you have been good on this issue.
Thank you for the compliment.
The evening presentations and my friend.
I understand. I appreciate it. Address for a moment, from my perspective, I've heard from my libertarian friends, I've heard a great uproar about this, which is not surprising to me. But Damon Root, for instance, writing at Reason, really goes after Alito, and there's a lot of talk about Ninth Amendment issues and things like that of unenumerated rights being at risk and that type of thing. They've described his decision as hand waving past a bunch of different legal issues. Talk to me about your attitude toward that general line of argument against the position Alito took.
Well, it's the critical part of it. You see this in the dissents, and the critical part behind this is that they don't recognize that there's another entity involved here. And they say, whose interests are being injected? Oh, it's only one that counts. Not like Bill Clinton vetoing the bill on partial birth abortion. He has all kinds of concern for the woman who may think she needs this, but for that being who's having his brain sucked out, pulled out of the womb in cancer, has nothing to say. That being doesn't count. You remember this from Huck Finn. Anybody can, oh, man, and that's what, remember once years ago, in a debate, I think it was at Yale, a libertarian said, why should I give any praise to that cluster of cells? And I said, why don't you tell me what gives you the standing as a person to bear those rights? Tell me what it is. And I want to find out what the principal difference is between you and what you call that cluster of cells. The libertarians have, who is it? Who's the bearer of those rights? Remember, James Wilson, one of the premier founders of UNO, said, if we have these natural rights, when did they begin? And the answer is, as soon as we begin to be. Okay? Which is why the common law casts its protection on human life from its first beginnings. Now, we have a curious echo of that by the chairman of the Judiciary Committee in 1987, opening the hearings of Robert Boyd. I have rights, he said, simply because I'm a child of God, rights that are given me for someone else. That was Joseph Biden.
Yeah.
Staking out a strong natural law position in contrast to Robert Boyd. But again, the key to this is the libertarians, they don't understand, they have a moral argument to make. It's a moral argument to make. And you have to ask them, who is the bearer of that right? What constitutes him as a bearer of that right? If it turns out it's a human being, then you have to explain to me what is wanting. You remember that old thing. You've been with Lincoln and that marvelous fragment he wrote himself. Why is this a conversation with a black man? Why is this black man? Why is he wanting it right? Is because he is less intelligent than you. Beware, the next white man who comes along more intelligent than you may write that slave is because he's darker. Beware, the next white man who comes along with a complexion lighter than you experience. It's simply no appeal to faith. It's simply what we call a principled argument. Then some of us would make the same argument and say, well, why is that offspring in the womb anything less than you? Doesn't speak yet. No, neither do Baptists. Other people lose arms and legs in the course of their lives. They don't lose anything necessary to their standing as human beings. So the upshot is, there's nothing you could cite to disqualify the black man as a bearer of rights that would not apply to many whites walking around. There's nothing one could cite to establish why that child in the womb is anything less than a human being than the person who's now exercising his franchise and trying to make a decision. That is the point that still hasn't broken through. Though I have known some libertarians who are pro-life.
Yeah.
They accept that.
I want to ask you about the nature of a certain aspect of this that seemed very telling to me when this case came forward, and certainly after the leaked decision, the conversation on the left shifted pretty dramatically to a parade of horribles. In other words, they went from the Planned Parenthood lines about shouting your abortion, representing kind of a retreat to saying, well, this is going to end up with women who miscarry getting arrested for D&Cs. It's going to end, they started using a lot of cases where they were basically trying to expand the realm into which this would, this type of decision would creep. To me, that kind of gave the game away. It kind of indicated that this thing that a recognition perhaps on the part that they have this extreme position that they have staked out, which was repeated again this weekend by Stacey Abrams, and has been repeated by many of their nominees for key offices in key states, of no restriction whatsoever at any point within pregnancy,
right,
for any kind of limit. And of course, in states like New York and California, federal funding or taxpayer funding to flow into the this whole process and make everything essentially free and available. It seemed to me that they retreated, that commentators started to retreat from that pretty quickly, and that they started to make these other arguments. Do you believe culturally that we've reached a point in America where the abortion movement and its espousers have gone so far and became so extreme on this issue, so far beyond safe, legal, and rare, that there was a natural cultural backlash to the position that they stuck out?
I wish there were. But first of all, that the movement has taken place is not quite. Look, take a look at our experience with the Born Alive Act. When we first brought that through, it was first passed in 2002. The Democrats had control of the Senate. Mm-hmm. And it was Harry Reid who brought that to the floor. When we gathered for a signing of the bill, Carl Rove asked me, he said, why do you think they did that? I said, why do you think they did it, Carl? He said, they must have thought somebody cared about it out there. Okay. But at the same time, when they did this in the House, they just did it in a voice vote because they want to be on the record, but it was a regrettable thing, but we don't want to embarrass ourselves. Now, 18 years later, we have Born Alive, the second, Born Alive 2, to restore the penalties. Now, utter cohesion on both sides. Almost virtually every Democrat in the House votes against that move to protect the child born alive. And it must be said to the Republicans, you've seen over the years, talk about what the political class is going to be like. The Republicans have this remarkable cohesion on the pro-life side. Every Republican voted for that bill. All Democrats, but 5 or 6 pro-lifers, most of them are gone now, voted for it. And now I'm also astounded by some figures I saw recently from Gallup saying that a few years ago, there was a number of people who thought abortions should be legit under all circumstances would be around 22 to 24%. And now it's risen to 34%. When you see Democrats in the House having no embarrassment about refusing to protect the child born alive, you see things have taken a real turn. You're saying the cultural war could be at the edge of a shooting war. Times, I think this is getting really quite deep.
Let's wrap up with this. This is a question that I actually have been asking a number of people over the past several weeks who've been involved in the pro-life cause or the movement or the legal battles and the like. Who's someone you wish you could have a conversation with today who didn't make it to see this decision? Given that there's been, half a century of work going into getting rid of Roe, with so many, religious, legal, political leaders along the way, fighting what many thought was a battle that would never result in a victory at the Supreme Court. Who would you like to be sitting down to have coffee with today to talk about the decision?
People on the other side, you mean?
People on either side. People who've passed on. People who didn't live to see this day.
Oh, I don't know. Almost nobody on the other side wants it to. One I miss most is the one Michael Newman, who wrote the first, working for James Buckley, wrote the first draft for the Human Life Amendment. And so, Scalia, and people who've written so ardently about this and worked so hard. Great late Bill Jefferson, the black doctor, On the other side, the interlocutors have kind of vanished. I mean, using strong pro-life Democrats, and even Casey from Pennsylvania, Bob Casey's son, is wobbly pro-lifers. There's almost nobody on the other side who they have the conversation. I mean, I have some former students in New York who wrote to me after the say, this was, congratulations, you've been working at some long level. And they're not with me on it. They're not with me on it. And I wonder, why have I not convinced you over the years? I've never written in a way that's convinced any other people. And you see, even these people who are aware that there's something wrong here, still reluctant to talk about it. Remember, you're a student of Lincoln's. Lincoln said, here's this issue of slavery. We can't talk about it in the churches. It's too explosive. We can't talk about it in politics. It's somehow the most central issue, and we can't find a place to talk about it. Well, of course, the lesson from that, as you know, Ben, is that the test of the statesman is he understands those issues that are really central to the nature of the regime and our crisis right now. And his task is to find some way of teaching people how to talk about it. So when Lincoln made those talks, you find the letters of the Civil War soldiers were carrying passages from Lincoln in giving freedom to the slave, we confirm freedom to the free. Things like that. So, but in order to do that, was it line from Sidney Greenstreet in The Maltese Falcon? My God, I love to talk, sir, with a man who loves to talk. I mean, you need practice at it. And we do need some practice at it. We have to have a willingness to talk about this thing. And we can start at 9 o'clock on Fox News. Who knows?
Well, thank you so much, Hadley, for taking the time to join me today for this conversation.
Sweet of you to offer me to invite me in, Ben. Thanks so much for that.
Always great to talk.
Okay. Bye-bye now.